You know that moment when a 7-year-old corrects your grammar? And the one who corrected them is an AI they've been talking to since breakfast? Yeah, that's not a glitch. That's Gen Alpha. Born between 2010 and 2024, this is the first generation in human history that didn't just grow up with technology, they grew up with technology that talks back. It's Psychology Unfolded, where we decode what makes you you. And before you roll your eyes and say, oh, great, another generation think piece, stay with me. Because what's happening inside their brains right now is genuinely unlike anything neuroscience has ever had to study before. This isn't about screen time. This isn't about bad parenting. This is about a fundamental rewiring of how a human brain develops when its earliest social interactions include a machine. So let's talk about what's actually going on. Here's the thing nobody wants to say out loud. Gen Alpha isn't just different from previous generations. They're different from Gen Z in ways that even Gen Z doesn't fully understand yet. And that gap, that's where it gets fascinating. Let's start at the very beginning, the brain. A child's brain between the ages of 0 and 7 is in what neuroscientists call a critical developmental window. This is when neural pathways form fastest, when the brain is essentially sculpting itself based on the environment it's in. Now, previous generations had TV. Gen Z had smartphones. But Gen Alpha? They have responsive, conversational, personalized AI from the moment they can form a sentence. And here's what that does to a developing brain. It changes the social learning loop entirely. Normally, a child learns social cues by interacting with humans. They say something, the other person reacts, sometimes with joy, sometimes with confusion, sometimes with frustration. And the child's brain logs all of it: tone, expression, timing. But when a significant portion of early interactions happen with AI, the feedback loop is different. AI is patient. AI doesn't get tired. AI doesn't have bad days. AI never sighs, never looks distracted, never makes you feel like a burden. Which sounds amazing, until you realize what that's actually teaching a developing nervous system. Researchers at the University of Washington found that children who interact heavily with voice-based AI assistants show a reduced ability to interpret ambiguous social cues compared to children with lower AI interaction. Their brains are learning to expect clarity, consistency, instant response. And the real world, it doesn't work like that. Real people are messy. Real people are delayed. Real people say one thing and mean another. And for a brain trained on AI precision, that messiness doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it feels like a system error. But here's where it gets really wild. This isn't just about social skills. It's about dopamine. Again, you thought Gen Z had a high dopamine baseline? Gen Z looks like patient monks compared to what's happening with Gen Alpha. Gen Z got their dopamine hits from scrolling. Swipe, reward, like reward, new video, reward. Fast, yes, but still, passive. Gen Alpha gets dopamine from AI that responds to them, specifically, personally, instantly. It's not just consuming content, it's co-creating it. It's having a conversation where they are the center of the universe every single time. Neuroscientist Dr. Jenny Radesky at the University of Michigan has studied how interactive versus passive screen time affects the reward systems of young children. The data is striking. Interactive AI engagement activates the brain's reward centers more intensely than passive video consumption, which means their dopamine threshold, their normal, is set even higher than Gen Z's was. The bar for interesting keeps climbing. So what happens when they have to sit in a classroom? What happens when the teacher can't respond to 20 kids simultaneously with perfectly tailored answers? What happens when learning is slow? Spoiler, it doesn't go great. But before you start writing them off as hopeless, wait. Because there's another side to this story that doesn't get told nearly enough. Gen Alpha is also remarkable. Here's what the doom and gloom headlines always skip. Gen Alpha is growing up with access to more information, more perspectives, and more tools than any generation before them. And their brains are adapting to that in genuinely impressive ways. Studies on children with early AI exposure show higher scores in creative problem-solving tasks. Not because AI does the thinking for them, but because they've learned to ask better questions. They've internalized a skill most adults spend decades trying to develop: how to find the right answer, not just memorize one. Think about that for a second. You spent years in school learning facts. They're learning how to think. There's also something fascinating happening with their identity development. Dr. Yalda Uhls, child development researcher and author of Media Moms and Digital Dads, points out that Gen Alpha is growing up in a world where self-expression has no gatekeepers. They create, they publish, they build audiences before they hit puberty. And this shapes the brain differently. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for identity, decision-making, and long-term planning, is getting activated in new ways. These kids aren't waiting to be told who they are. They're constructing identity in real time, publicly, iteratively, which is either terrifying or brilliant, depending on how you look at it. Now, before you think this is all sunshine and perfectly rendered AI art, let's talk about the anxiety piece, because it's real and it's different from what we saw in Gen Z. Gen Z's anxiety was largely driven by social comparison. Am I good enough? Do people like me? Gen Alpha's anxiety has a new flavor. It's existential. They're growing up hearing that AI might take their future jobs, that the planet is in crisis, that the information they consume might be fake. They're being asked to trust a world that keeps telling them not to trust anything. Psychologist Twenge, who has tracked generational mental health data for decades, warns that this combination of hyperconnectivity and existential uncertainty creates a chronic low-grade stress response in developing brains. Cortisol, your stress hormone, elevated not from one big threat, but from 1,000 small ones every single day. And their nervous systems are learning to live there, in that constant low hum of uncertainty. So what does all of this mean? What do you do with a generation this complex? Here's the thing. Gen Alpha doesn't need to be fixed. They need to be understood. Their brains aren't broken. They're just running a different operating system, one that was built for a world that hasn't fully arrived yet. They'll struggle with patience. They'll struggle with ambiguity. They'll struggle with human messiness that no algorithm can smooth out. But they'll also build things we can't imagine. They'll solve problems we gave up on. They'll connect across differences in ways that would take previous generations years of effort. Because here's what nobody says about the iPad kids. They were handed impossible complexity at an impossible age, and they're still here, still curious, still creating. That's not weakness. That's something else entirely. So next time you see a kid talking to an AI like it's a best friend, don't panic. Ask yourself what they might be learning, what they might be building, what kind of world they're quietly preparing for. Because ready or not, it's their world next.